So tonight's short lecture, which is about a half an hour, is on orchids, which has a nice symmetry for this week. We have Mother's Day coming up on Sunday. So, okay, away we go. Orchid fever. Orchids are a fascinating family of plants for their beauty and role in history, and as we're soon going to learn, for the way that they live. They've been an inspiration for the writer, romanticist, philosopher, and fanatic, especially the fanatic in a global market during Victorian times that drove those who pursued these floral treasures to acts of insanity. Beware, though, because as can be witnessed in this quote, once you get hooked on orchids, you are well hooked indeed. So let's begin this discussion about your possible next obsession by stepping back in time, all the way to ancient Greece. Orchids, often having sensual flowers and alluring aromas, have a long-standing reputation of ill repute and have historically been thought of as being unchaste. This salacious reputation is tightly connected to the etymology of the word, as orchid is the modernized Latin form of the Greek word orchis, and orchis means testicle. See, many of the orchid species in the Mediterranean have dual tubers, like the Orchis genus type species, Orchis militaris, and as you can see right away, very little imagination was required on the part of the ancient Greeks to make that connection. From ancient Greece until well into the 17th century, a disturbingly long time, medical knowledge used to be greatly influenced by a pseudoscience called the doctrine of signatures, whereby plants were used for medicinal purposes according to their resemblance to parts of the human anatomy. Thus, not surprisingly, consuming orchids tubers was thought to stimulate lust and to influence the sex of a newborn. Large young tubers, when eaten by a male, produce baby boys. Older, smaller tubers, when consumed by a female, produce baby girls, or so it was believed. Even modern medical terminology continues this association. An undescended testicle is a cryptorchidism, and the removal of a testicle is an orchiectomy. Orchids also make an appearance in mythology, as they quite naturally associated the sexually charged orchid with Aphrodite, goddess of love, and the voluptuous genus of orchids called lady slipper, or Venus's slipper. Remember, in the Roman pantheon of gods, Aphrodite was called Venus. It's named in her honor. According to legend, one day, while Venus and Adonis were hunting together, a tremendous thunderstorm arrived. They quickly found shelter from the storm and, air quotes, made the most of their time together. But in the aftermath, Venus accidentally forgot her golden slipper. So when a mortal discovered it later and tried to pick it up, it was immediately transformed into this orchid, Cypripedium calceolus. This genus, Cypripedium, and another lady slipper genus from Asia pay homage to Cyprus, the goddess's sacred island. Paphio down here is for Paphos, Cyprus, which is where the goddess of love first landed after she rose from the sea, beautifully rendered here by Botticelli. As rich as Western history is with orchid lore, it's likely not as deep as what you'd find in the Orient, where none other than Confucius, founding father of Chinese thought, first celebrated the orchid for its special qualities and awarded it primacy amongst plants. The most attractive feature was the gentle perfume, understated yet pervasive, yet found in certain species like this one, the noble orchid. He felt its fragrance was symbolic of virtue and wisdom, yet with moderation so as not to oppress others. Here's an enjoyable philosophical quote by the master here. Not to be outdone, Japan likewise has a rich orchid history, where the first mention comes from an ancient tale where the wife of an emperor, after years of being unable to produce an heir, managed to give birth to 13 children in succession after deeply inhaling the inebriating perfume of this orchid, presently known as 13 Great Treasures. Along with asters, orchids are the largest plant family with more than 25,000 species, which, to put it into context, that's about 10% of all plants, and they exist in a seemingly infinite diversity of form, function, and location. We tend to think of orchids as tropical plants, but you can find them just about everywhere except for Antarctica, although there are 2 species in Patagonia, and that's pretty darn close. In general, though, they are much more abundant in the tropics. About 80% of the species are found there. In the country of Ecuador, most biodiverse place on the planet, has the greatest orchid species density on the planet, with 4,200 species. My girlfriend, by the way, is Una Ecuatoriana, so I thought I'd toss in a photo of the neighborhood in Quito where she's from, and just in case it's not clear, Orquídeas, the name of her barrio, is how you say orchids in Spanish. Don't worry though, you don't have to buy a plane ticket to the tropics to see a wild orchid. We have about 200 species in the US and Canada, although many of those are in Florida. We have about 35 species in our region, most of which are rare and all of which are terrestrial, which brings up another point. As you move to warmer climates, orchids tend to be epiphytes, or plants that grow on top of other plants, usually in a canopy, like in this wonderful painting of an epiphyte orchid and a hummingbird. Closest epiphyte orchid to us, however, is in the Carolinas. Since it's talk about flowers, I thought we'd do a very quick review of the typical parts. So starting here at the base, you have a group of green leaves that are called the sepals. They're in the shape of a cup. It's a receptacle for the other parts of the flower. Petals are modified leaves, and they are colored to attract pollinators. While in the center, we have the business end. These are the sexual parts. The male parts produce pollen, and they are called stamens. Female part is called the pistil. It's over here in the center, and pollen travels down through this tube to fertilize the ovaries at the bottom. And that is how sexual reproduction works in flowers. And that is so much easier than trying to wrap your head around sexual reproduction in fungi. Great example of the pistil is over here on the crocus flower that gives us saffron. Note the scarlet color of that pistil. It is necessary to harvest 70,000 flowers all by hand to have 1 pound of saffron. And that is why saffron is so darn expensive. Now that we know more or less parts of a flower, in this drawing, we're going to see how orchids are different from other typical flowers, like this tulip over here on the left. So first, in orchids, there are usually 3 sepals, 1, 2, 3, and 3 petals, 1, 2, 3. Sepals are normally green in other flowers, but in orchids, the sepals are not usually green, but colorful, like the rest of the flower. Of the 3 petals that orchids have, the petal down here at the bottom has a different shape, and this petal is called the lip or labellum, and it often serves as the landing pad for the pollinator. Most flowers, too, have radial symmetry, so they can be halved on several points to achieve a mirror image. Just think of a dandelion. But orchids tend to have bilateral symmetry, so they can only be bifurcated on this one axis. Most important thing to note, however, are the sexual parts. In orchids, they're not separated like in other flowers, but they are fused together in a structure in the center that's called a column. So for a little more color and beauty, I thought I'd toss in a Catalia orchid painting over here on the left by the greatest flower painter of all time, Georgia O'Keeffe. Odd name of this painting is because Georgia's friend Narcissia gifted this orchid to the painter. And when she forgot to send a thank you note, Narcissia was sufficiently offended that she never gave her another. As you can see in this picture, orchid seeds are incredibly small, much smaller than poppy seeds, mustard seeds, salt grains. This is because seeds have material inside of them to provide energy during germination. A wheat germ has most of its seed mass as endosperm, let's say here, 83%. That's carbohydrates surrounding the embryo, so that seed has something to consume during germination. Orchid seeds have nothing. No carbohydrate stores for germination, and that is why orchid seeds are as light as dust and sown by the wind. Vanilla is an orchid, so if you ever split a vanilla bean in half, all those black specks are seeds, and it is entirely feasible for a single orchid to flower to produce hundreds of thousands or even millions of seeds annually. In this slide, we talk about the connection between plants and fungi, and specifically the unique connection that orchids have in general. Plants feed the fungus carbohydrates made during photosynthesis, and the fungus gives the plant water and minerals that it absorbs from the soil. This is super, super common. High percentage of all plants have one or more partner fungi to help them survive. We heard a great talk about this by Suzanne Smart a few months ago. For orchids, however, that figure is definitely 100%. So if you remember on that last picture, I spoke of orchid seeds having no food. When a seed lands somewhere, it has to wait sometimes for years until there is contact with a compatible fungus to give it nutrition. And until this connection occurs and the seed can parasitize nutrition from the fungus, the orchid seed simply can't grow. In short, if it weren't for fungi, there would be no orchids. In this diagram, you can see the various types of connections between fungi and plants. Top three, these are cosmopolitan attachments. If you look down here in the lower right, you'll see there is a unique type of connection just for orchids. And this is most likely pure parasitism, at least at first and probably throughout. What occurs is that the orchid will permit this fungus, the invading fungus, to penetrate the cell walls, but not the cell membrane. And that cell membrane will encircle the invading fungi like a glove. And once it's inside, that fungal hyphae, it'll continue to grow in an effort to increase surface area until it forms these tight coils that are called pelotons. The orchid, though, it's running this relationship, it's controlling this. And each of these intracellular pelotons will become a food source and be consumed by the orchid within a couple of days. Pelotons may form and be consumed within the same cell many, many times in this fashion. And as I said before, this is probably pure parasitism. The first stage of growth in orchids, the embryonic stage, is called a protocorm. And it will typically be green in tropical orchids, so it can begin to photosynthesize right away. While the terrestrial orchids that we have here will not have the ability to photosynthesize for a much longer time, sometimes for several years, and they will continue to parasitize fungi for all of their nutritional needs. Naturally, there are good odds that the seed will never locate a mycorrhizal partner, or the fungi may turn the tables and consume the orchid seed or protocorm. Thus, the large number of seeds that orchids produce make up for the fact that the odds of becoming a seed-bearing orchid adult are quite small. Adult orchid-fungi relationships are really varied. And while it's thought that most, if not all, orchids continue to maintain some level of mycorrhizae as adults, it is going to require a lot more study. There are no easy answers, but I tried to assemble a few guidelines. So orchids in general can establish a connection with many different types of fungi, but most often that fungi will be a basidiomycete, and that basidiomycete will be from a ubiquitous group of soil saprotropes and pathogens from the genus Rhizoctonia. Since we don't talk about Rhizoctonia on forays, it almost never produces a fruiting body. By example, we have the Rhizoctonia type species down here, Rhizoctonia solani, which causes, among other things, those brown patches in turf grass. Depending on the species, the adult orchid may be able to photosynthesize most of its nutritional needs, essentially become an autotroph. And these types of orchids tend to have a greater number of compatible fungal partners. At the other end of the spectrum, orchids that lack chlorophyll completely and then are thus entirely parasitic on fungi for their whole lifespan are called mycoheterotrophs, and they tend to have very few compatible fungal partners. An example of a mycoheterotroph is over here on the right, the spotted coral root orchid, which associates with these guys, Rusula fungi. Macula means spotted. Look at that teeny tiny little spot on the labellum there. And while iNaturalist does have some observations of this montane-loving orchid to the west of us along the Allegheny front, you're most likely going to have to travel to New England to catch a glimpse. Spotted coral root also has a poem written by none other than Robert Frost. And that is quite a resume builder for the often unnoticed spotted coral root. Another point to make about adult orchids, in some cases, typically during times of stress, like drought or overbrowsing by deer, the orchid can become subterranean again, sometimes for years and years, in a state that's described as prolonged dormancy, where it will receive all of its nutritional requirements from fungi. Unsurprisingly, the more an orchid relies on a fungal partner for its nutritional needs, the more likely it engages in prolonged dormancy. Okay, so now it's time for the fun stuff. The reason there are more orchids than any other family of plants is because of coevolution. Orchids have evolved with their pollinators, and many times this happened with insects that do not work with any other plant. For that reason, Darwin was fascinated by orchids. He even wrote a book about them called, I love this title, The Various Contrivances by Which Orchids Are Fertilized by Insects. And this orchid, called Darwin's Orchid, was his favorite. It has a 12-inch tube with a drop of nectar all the way down at the bottom of that spur. Darwin said there must be a moth that co-evolved with this plant with an equally long tongue. And of course, the experts at the time laughed at this statement. But eventually, they did discover this moth with a giant proboscis. And he was proven correct, albeit 21 years after he passed away. It takes a lot of energy to produce sugar in nectar, which is why about a third of all orchids don't even bother, and instead use other strategies to attract insects to distribute their pollen for free. One of the most common tricks is the use of scent. Now, this should be of no surprise to us. There's a lot of mimicry in nature. Think of stinkhorns, for example, and how they use scent to attract carrion feeding insects. The male orchid bees in Latin America have a unique relationship with orchids in the genus Coryanthes catasetum stanhopinae. Male bees accumulate orchid pheromones in these enlarged hind legs because it makes them more attractive to female bees, like Ralph Lauren cologne, except for bugs. The more they carry, the more attractive they smell, which is why they will visit as many flowers as possible carrying pollen with them. Orchid pollen, by the way, is usually encased in a waxy package called a pollinium, and that sticks to the insect. So don't blame orchids for your allergies. Their pollen isn't wind dispersed. These Coryanthes orchids are just freaking awesome, by the way. They are the largest orchid flower. It's called the bucket orchid because when a bee lands on it, it's going to slide on this waxy surface into this liquid-filled modified labellum. And since it's wet, it can't fly away. So it has to climb up the grooves in this tunnel on the far side until it reaches the top, and it gets that pollinium pasted onto the top of its head as a departing gift. This genus lives in arboreal ant colonies, and not only does it use scent to attract these orchid bees, it also uses scent to attract the ants too. Ants are commonly used for seed dispersal by plants. $10 word for that is myrmecochory, but they don't do it for free. The seeds that work with ants have a food treat attached to the end to make it worth their while. As you remember, orchid seeds are practically nothing. So the bucket orchid uses scent again to fool the ants into thinking they're the same as the other seeds that offer a reward. My mind though, hippest orchid genus of all, this handsome devil, Dracula orchids. So named for those long fangs on their sepals. I mean, come on, look at that maniacal beauty. And a flower named Dracula Vampira, now that just totally kicks ass. And one of the other species, Carta de Mono, is an unintentional mimic, a teeny tiny little monkey face. In addition to being thoroughly awesome, though, the reason I'm including Dracula orchids on this page is because it's thought that many of them release a mushroom aroma and thus attract fungal gnats and flies that frequently visit mushrooms as breeding and brood sites in the tropics. Orchid ingenuity is greatest, though, when it gets its pollination work done for free by tricking insects into having sex with it, pseudocopulation. First example is of an Australian hammer orchid, which uses scent, and I guess a passing resemblance to a female wasp, to fool this love-struck fella, flipping him upside down so that waxy pollen sac, the polinium, gets pasted onto his back. And below, we have the European bee orchid, which plays a similar trick on love-struck young male bees. Over here in this photo, well, we're not sure what the pollinator is for the butterfly orchids. It's probably a lusty male butterfly, but maybe it's another insect that attacks it to defend its territory. But what we do know for sure is that when the Duke of Devonshire first laid eyes on this beauty in 1833, he was the one who experienced love at first sight, and thus sparked the phenomenon known as orchid mania. Exotic orchids were so popular and so highly priced during Victorian times that many explorers entered the darkest and wildest places on the planet in search of new and exotic species. Of course, this was extremely dangerous work, and many never came back. Cause of death, orchid fever. On this page, I have some random trivia, like this Turkish ice cream, which is called Dondurama. It's very popular and stretchy because they dry and powder those Mediterranean orchid tubers that I talked about earlier and add them into the recipe. And here is the ghost orchid, which is found in Florida and Cuba, that inspired this wonderful and successful book, The Orchid Thief, which in turn was the inspiration for a pretty good movie called Adaptation. In this photo, botanical drawing, we have vanilla, most popular spice in the world. And because orchids can be aromatic, they're often the inspiration for perfumes, like this one called Black Orchid. Banda orchid is one of the traditional flowers woven into the Hawaiian lei. And how could a trivia collection be complete without a reference to James Bond? In the movie Moonraker, the supervillain Hugo Drax wanted to kill the planet with poison from the fictional Black Orchid. Hugo Drax, of course, no match for James Bond. So now we're going to take a look at a couple local orchids. This is the Cranefly orchid. This is an orchid that likes mesic hardwood forest. Most likely you'll find it during wintertime when it extends this single leaf, one of the few green spots in the winter forest, with this striking purple underside. And it often grows in colonial groups like in this photo. It's called Cranefly because it used to be thought it was pollinated by this guy, the cranefly, but we now know it's pollinated by a moth. Since this orchid photosynthesizes during winter, given that the temperature is above 32, it's not covered with snow or leaf litter, it has a strategic advantage because obviously there isn't any competition for light in the winter forest. It has multiple compatible fungal partners, and you will often find it in abundance in well-rotted woody debris. It produces nectar, and it is our most common orchid. The Downy rattlesnake plantain. This is a long-lived evergreen orchid with this basal rosette of leaves with a striking white venation. Flowers in late summer, prefers to grow on dry upland slopes, no leaf litter or rock shelves. It's tolerant of a wide range of other soil types because it has multiple fungal partners, which makes it the second most common orchid in our area. It has a non-traditional pollinator. It's sweat bees, but no nectar reward. This orchid has two common names, Adam and Eve, because it has dual tubers connected by a thin rhizome, and putty root because those tubers contain a mucilaginous substance. It used to be used as pottery glue. It prefers rich mesic upland forest and pushes up that single striking pinstripe leaf in late fall to overwinter like the Cranefly orchid. But you're going to have to wait until May or June to see, after the leaf senesces, to see these flowers. No nectar reward for this flower either. Here's a local orchid that really lives up to its name, the Showy Orchid. You'll find it in rich mesic forests where it blooms generally in April in our area. Those large striking flowers are a mix of a white labellum and lavender, which readily attracts pollinators, in particular, queen bumblebees. And it does provide a nectar reward. Probably the best area to see it is at Thompson Wildlife Management Area in Virginia. And that's probably because the deer population there, which love to consume orchids, is kept in check by hunting. Here's an orchid that doesn't look like a typical orchid. The nodding lady tresses. Tresses is an archaic word for a long lock of hair. And with this spiraling inflorescence, does seem a little bit like a braided plait of hair. Nodding is for the downward slant of these individual flowers. It's an orchid you'll find in a wet meadow or a bog, and it can be 1 to 2 feet tall. Orchids tend to find niche habitats, canopy, rock ledge, and in particular bogs, where there's less competition from other species. One way to make this work to your advantage is if you decide to build a home bog garden, where you can grow spiranthe species like this one, acquired from a reputable vendor, please, and also carnivorous plants like pitcher plants, sundews, maybe even toss in a Venus flytrap, which are indigenous to the Carolinas. Here's the yellow fringed orchid, which is another bog species that's readily distinguished by that fringe on its labellum. It's another good species for the home bog garden. This Audubon print off to the right is a good test of what kind of person you are. So if you first notice this tawny thrush, you're a birder. First notice these edible bunchberries, you're a forager. But if you first notice that fringed orchid, then you just might be suffering from orchid fever. Save the best for last with a couple of gorgeous local lady slippers, but I'd personally prefer the alternative name, moccasin flower. Both a yellow and a pink one. Pink one's much more common, and it engages in deception to get its pollination work done for free. Bee enters this balloon-shaped labellum down here at the bottom fold, and once it's inside and trapped, it can't get out, it finally sees light streaming down through this little hole right at the top. So whenever the bee has to crawl out of that hole, it gets that waxy polinium pasted onto its head as a parting gift. That flower, believe it or not, that singular flower, believe it or not, will produce up to 1 million seeds. And you can see it in April to July, most likely April in our area, in low pH soil that's often, but not exclusive to conifers. And this orchid will often live underground for many, many years after flowering to build up its energy reserves again. And sometimes that prolonged dormancy, it can last up to 2 decades. So now we're going to close out with some of the many political entities that have chosen orchids as their representative. Here we have the showy lady slipper from the state of Minnesota. Here we have the only hybrid national flower, the Vanda Miss Joaquin from Singapore. We'll be in Latin America, rest of the way out. Here is the Orchidia de Pascua from Venezuela, the Easter orchid. Look at that nice purple color for the Passion of the Christ. Here we have the Orchidia de Navidad from Colombia, the Christmas orchid. Flor del Espíritu Santo from Panama, the Holy Spirit flower. Guarilla morada from Costa Rica. What a beauty that is. Orchidia de la Virgen from Honduras, the Virgin's orchid. It is said that this orchid has the most fetching aroma of all. Here we have the Orchidia de Concha from Belize, the clamshell orchid, sometimes called the black orchid. And over here on the right, this wonderful botanical drawing, you have clamshell orchids, dollar orchids, and just for good measure, you got a monarch butterfly, all done by Mark Catesby. Mark Catesby was the botanical artist in the Americas prior to John James Audubon. Ended with the best, La Monja Blanca from Guatemala, the white nun. That is one exquisite creature. That flower is sheer perfection. Final slide, one final painting by the great Georgia O'Keeffe of another orchid, and a quote by the artist where she likens nurturing a friendship to observing a flower. Still, in a way, nobody sees a flower. Really, it's so small, we haven't time. And to see takes time, like to have a friend takes time. I like that. Speaking of time, I'd like to thank you for your time. This was a lot of fun for me, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thanks again.